Now, firstly, I apologise for the delay. The questions that we received rather late in the day had to be considered. There was a fair number of them, and our views on them had to be obtained, so we took some time doing that. Now, can I simply say that due to the complexity of some of the proposed Rule 9 questions which we received over the last 2 days, some of them this morning, and the time constraints we have, it may, we'll see, not be possible to put them all to the panel members today. As co-participants will be aware, I've already issued a direction inviting written statements following the conclusion of the current hearings. That direction includes an invitation to identify any issue of medicine or science on which co-participants consider the inquiry does not have sufficient evidence before it is able to discharge its terms of reference. Information received in response to that invitation will inform an internal review of the evidence before this inquiry and the United Kingdom 19 inquiry. Having conducted that review, the inquiry will determine whether it is appropriate to instruct additional expert evidence. Any approved Rule 9 questions that cannot be answered today will also inform the inquiry review of evidence that I've described. Any additional expert evidence instructed following the review will be disclosed, of course, in due course. So with that, can I ask Ms van der Westerhuizen to commence asking the questions to the experts, please, or to the panel.
Thank you, my Lord. We've had a series of questions in, as His Lordship said. Some are directed to Dr. Tegnell and some are directed to Sir Ashley and some are directed at both. So I'll indicate as we go through who they're from, first of all, and who they're directed at, and give you an opportunity to respond. I propose to read the questions out verbatim. It's probably just easier than trying to paraphrase and lose things in translation. Thank you. Could you highlight that? So the first two questions are from the Scottish ministers, and they were directed at Professor Bloomfield, but I'll give Sir Ashley, and I'll give Dr. Tegnell a chance to respond as well. The question is, at various points in your written response, you mention the population vaccination programme that ran in New Zealand. In your opinion, was that programme effective? And if you consider it was effective, in what way or ways was it effective, and amongst which groups in the New Zealand society?
Thank you. Yes, I do consider the programme was effective. The first element of its effectiveness was we knew we had a rapidly developed, highly effective vaccine, in the sense that it was highly effective at preventing hospitalisation and death. Some effectiveness in preventing transmission, but not great on that front. So first of all, we had a very effective and relatively very safe vaccine as well from the controlled trials. The next element of the effectiveness, of course, was the extent to which we could vaccinate a high proportion of the population, and we achieved that across the full range of age and ethnic groups in our population. Some differences, but most importantly, the highest risk group, which was older people, we had very high vaccination rates. And third, we saw in New Zealand that when we did get our community outbreak from Omicron, we had lower hospitalisation and death rates than had been experienced in other countries in earlier outbreaks. Now, in part, this was due to the Omicron variant of the virus being less severe or virulent in terms of its impact, but we did see that the vaccine provided considerable protection for those people who were vaccinated. And when we compared outcomes for vaccinated and unvaccinated people, it was quite clear that vaccination had a protective effect against hospitalisation, serious illness, and death from COVID-19.
Thank you. And then the second part of this question is, in your opinion, by what means can effectiveness of the vaccines that were administered in New Zealand be assessed? Are randomised control trials, or RCTs, the only means by which their effectiveness can be assessed? The question goes on. I'll perhaps read the whole thing out and you can break it up in your answer. Is it legitimate to gauge their effectiveness by reference to real-world vaccine effectiveness studies? And then they've provided two studies which I understand you've had sight of. For example, The two studies that were published in the UK are the Siren study, published in June 2022, and the BMJ study on the effectiveness of the Pfizer, BioNTech and Oxford AstraZeneca vaccines, published in May 2021. And it goes on to say, did New Zealand rely on this type of study when shaping its COVID vaccination programme?
So Dr. Tegnell has a lot of expertise in vaccines, but what I would say is the role of randomised controlled trials is actually quite limited in terms of assessing the overall effectiveness of vaccination and of most public health programs. The role in terms of vaccine programs is in assessing actually the efficacy and safety of new vaccines in very controlled circumstances that then provide a basis for being able to deploy those vaccines in populations. After that, it's a matter of using routinely collected data and comparing outcomes of interest, in this case, whether people got COVID-19, whether they became seriously ill, were hospitalised or died, and then depending on their vaccination status. And all the studies in New Zealand that we did of this, and all the ones globally, show categorically that vaccination was protective in terms of the outcomes I've described. But once you're deploying a vaccine in a population, a randomised control trial is no longer necessary, nor is it the right sort of intervention to use, or study to use, sorry.
Thank you very much. The second
I think
question.
Tegnell wants to say something.
Oh, sorry.
Just to add to that in the field of vaccine, we usually talk about the efficiency of vaccine and the effectiveness of vaccine. The efficiency is what we do in RCTs to sort of see that it's safe and that it sort of, at least in this very small population that we test, it is also give protection. The effectiveness is what happens out in the population. And the two of them are not very seldom similar. Sometimes you get more and sometimes you get less. So this is a well-known phenomenon, and as I would say, it's also not the right tool, but it's not even an ethical tool to use at that stage. And I think we have similar studies from many places. We could also show that the protective level for elderly people not to end up in hospitals or in ICUs were like 90–95%. So it was a very good vaccine. And I know that WHO has come out and said we have saved somewhere between 2 and 3 million lives in Europe alone due to the vaccinations. So they did an enormous difference to our hospital services and to the mortality.
Thank you. Well, I can perhaps ask you part A of the question then as well. In your opinion, was the program that was used in Sweden effective? And if you consider it was effective, in what way or ways was it effective, and amongst which groups?
It was very effective in saving many of our elderly.
Sorry, I've just had another request. If I could ask you to slow down a little bit, please.
No, it was very effective in saving many lives, for sure. It was very effective in helping our hospital services to have a reasonable workload during the spring of 2021, because when the new variants came and everything, and the waning immunity and many things coincided during that time, we saw actually a very big spread, the biggest spread we had ever seen from COVID-19 during that spring. And if we didn't have so many of the most vulnerable people protected by the vaccine by then, I think that would have been a great risk in Sweden for our hospital system to be overwhelmed.
Thank you. So, next part of the question for Sir Ashley is in paragraph 7 and 9 of your written response. You refer to a range of inputs, including scientific and modelling inputs, that informed not simply the initial decision to lock down, but subsequent population-wide restrictions, such as limits on gathering size, workplace, public place and school closures, physical distancing and the use of masks. And then, as you mentioned at paragraph 10.5, the New Zealand Royal Commission found that such measures had been effective. And there are three parts to the question. First part, one assumes from the absence of their mention that the said decision taken and restrictions introduced by New Zealand were not largely informed, if at all, by the results of RCTs. Is that correct?
That is correct, and no country's decisions were informed by RCTs, because in that situation you're not in a position to undertake a randomised controlled trial. And perhaps just to reiterate my earlier point, that actually randomised controlled trials have an important but actually relatively limited role in the field of medicine, and particularly in public health, in terms of determining the efficacy and safety and possibly cost of interventions. But once you then start to deploy those interventions in the wider population, or if you're in a situation like a pandemic where there's an extant threat and you need to respond immediately, you're not in a position to undertake a randomised controlled trial. And Dr. Tegnell and I were discussing, trying to think about how you potentially could, but actually, I mean, in the real world, you just couldn't undertake one, and neither would it would be neither ethical nor tenable to do that.
Thank you. Then the next part of the question is, in your view, standing the emergency situation that faced New Zealand, would it have been legitimate to await the outcome of RCTs?
No, it would have been a disaster, actually. And Dr. Tegnell will probably remember this, but Dr. Mike Ryan from the WHO made a comment in March 2020 where he encouraged every country to decide on which path they were going to go down and to make a firm decision and then go down with no regrets. There was no potential path that was wait for the outcome of randomised controlled trials, except for those for vaccines, candidate vaccines that were being developed at the time or were rapidly developed after that.
Thank you. And then the final part to the question is, in such an emergency situation, in your opinion, to what extent are governments required to rely on alternative sources of information aside from RCTs? Okay, sorry, I understand we might have a potential breach that just going to stop the transcript. Dr. Michael.
Tell me what it is. You don't need
sorry.
to say it out loud. Yes.
Some behavioural interventions and can produce what is commonly thought of as gold standard evidence. However, that then needs to also be tested in the real world, and very often there is a difference between what's found in those very controlled, randomised controlled trials and the real world experience. But in responding to an emergency situation, a randomised controlled trial is just not a feasible study methodology to deploy.
Thank you very much.
Can I just add to that in the aftermath of the pandemic, we had a lot of discussions and reviews in Europe, and one of the suggestions from that is that we need to be much better in following up the effects of what we are doing, and I think that's what we need to do. RCTs will never really help us, and they will probably be unethical and unpractical in many ways. Mm-hmm. But on the other hand, we need to have a better system in place so that we quickly can collect data and follow up the effects of both interventions and the disease. And there is a number of projects and initiatives in the European setting to make this possible, to access even more data than we had this time. to do it jointly in a manner that we can very quickly sort of follow the development. And I think that's really what we need to do to be able to do the right thing and to change when needed to change.
Thank you very much, Dr. Egnell. I think that's been answered. Dr. Taylor, I think you've probably answered this already, but just it's a specific related question from another core participant from Scottish COVID Bereaved, and it ties in with a question that the Scottish ministers had for Dr. Bloomfield. In an emergency situation, in your opinion, to what extent are governments required to rely on alternative sources of information aside from RCTs?
No, as I said, I think we all agree, and I think the Swedish Corona Commission and several others pointed to the necessity of having good legal instruments and good practical instruments in place so that we can run big follow-up registry-based studies very quickly during a pandemic to get a better understanding on what's actually happening and not least the effect of interventions that we're starting up.
Thank you very much. It's related. We next have a series of questions for Dr. Tegnell, and this is from the Scottish Vaccine Injury Group. The first question is, in your testimony on the 24th of September, you twice referred to immunity levels in the community and once mentioned how that data was fed into your modelling to help predict hospital capacity requirements. Can you tell us how you measured immunity levels?
It was done by what we would call a prevalence study. What we did in practice is that we, by random, chose some 3,000–4,000 people in the Swedish population, spread all over and being representative as much possible. And then we asked those people to test themselves and send the testing to us centrally so we could run them. And that way we got an idea about how many people at any given moment who actually were carrying the virus, and that gave us the prevalence at that given time.
Thank you. The second question is, if you were able to measure immunity or antibody levels, was any consideration that vaccines may not be necessary for individuals who already had natural immunity, particularly as the vaccines that we had a witness the other day, Dr. Ashley Croft indicated earlier this week, were new gene therapies, so it was not yet certain if the benefits outweighed the risks for every age group.
We had a considerable discussion around that. Was it necessary to vaccinate people with already somehow proven disease? Mm-hmm. And we discussed it back and forth in different ways, and our conclusion was yes. One is that the immunity was, even after natural infection, is not very long-lived, quite short, starting to wane after 3 or 4 months. And then giving an extra boost by also vaccinating people would prolong that period and protect them much longer. And also that there were studies showing that having natural disease and then getting also the vaccine increased the protection even higher up, because not even natural disease gives a complete protection. So we ended up that our conclusion was yes. And beside that, it was also the complexity of sort of saying who has enough antibodies and how shall we test them. And it's quite expensive to test for antibodies. And we are now in the middle of a mass vaccination campaign. It was not really feasible to run that specific way of doing things, even if the question was asked by a few people now and then.
Thank you. You've explained Sweden's approach to mask wearing, but they just want to ask if you considered nasal sprays as an alternative.
Nasal sprays, in what kind of nasal sprays?
I don't know.
I don't think it's an alternative. At least I don't know of any nasal spray that gives protection like that. I would know what that was.
Thank you.
And you got anything to say about that, so Ashley?
Oh, just if there's a question about whether there'd be some sort of nasal spray that could disinfect the respiratory tract or the upper respiratory tract, and therefore reduce the likelihood someone who was infected of exhaling infected aerosols, then I've never seen any studies or evidence or discussion about that approach. So it wouldn't be an alternative to mask wearing.
And your very answer was hypothetical, if there was a nasal spray. I take it from that answer you're not aware of such a nasal spray.
No.
Thank you. And Dr. Tagle, in your testimony on the afternoon of Wednesday the 24th, you said that for your vaccination rollout, you prioritised elderly people over healthcare workers because you wanted to vaccinate those most at risk. Obviously, everyone had to make judgments based on very little evidence. Did you monitor that situation? For example, do you have any data on how your healthcare workers' sickness levels compared to those of healthcare workers in other countries?
I'm not aware of any comparison of healthcare workers in different countries, unfortunately. As I said, we did repeated register-based studies on the risk for different kind of professions. And we did not find that the health profession had a very high level of risk of getting infected. And within the high level, within the health profession, we found that the persons at the highest risk of being infected were actually people working in psychiatric diseases, showing that people who don't know that they are meeting people in more social circumstances than as a patient and a doctor are probably more at risk. And the people that actually knew that they were meeting people who had COVID were able to protect themselves really well. So, and if there is a difference between health personnel in different countries, I'm not aware of that. Sorry.
And do you think, well, you've probably just answered it, do you think that you were doing anything else differently from other nations to protect your health care staff?
No, I think in that area, I think there was quite a lot of international consensus about what was needed to be done to protect your health personnel, and as evidence, or at least understanding of the disease and how it was spread and so on, I think we got better and better at it, and I think in the end we can say that we were able to protect our health staff reasonably well. Once again, when we go back to our contact tracing and so on, and when we found outbreaks among health personnel, we could usually trace it back to the cafeteria or the what we in Sweden call fikapaus.
And one last question from this core participant is, you mention in your testimony that while in your view the vaccines did not greatly reduce transmission, they did contribute to preventing severe illness, and that employers had a duty to manage the situation if staff did not want to be vaccinated. They would need to provide a separate physical workspace for them. Was this something that was arranged on an ad hoc basis, or was there a formalized, centralized policy put in place for this?
No, it's not a question of a special workspace. It's more that they get another kind of work. So, for example, if you work in healthcare, maybe you will be assigned to some more bureaucratic position for the time being, and so on, and similar in other circumstances. So it's more finding a position within your company or whatever that does not expose the individual to the disease. You can protect them by vaccinating them.
Thank you. This is two questions actually for Sir Ashley, and it's from the Bereaved Relatives group in Skye. The first question is, in your evidence on the 25th today, Sir Ashley stated the bubble concept was very much a concept that was used in care homes to the extent possible. What does Sir Ashley mean by to the extent possible?
So, and I just had a quick look at this, during this morning's question or period. The bubbles were used to try and separate individual residents from each other or small groups of residents, and to the extent possible to have consistency of staff who were working with groups of residents. So in a sense they were bubbles of residents and staff within different facilities. So that's what I was referring to in that instance.
Thank you. And the next question is also bubble related. When was the bubble introduced for care home residents?
One of the things that happened in New Zealand, and I think in many other countries, was that even as even well before the first lockdown, many older people in the community were already starting to isolate and limit their exposure to other people well before we had even introduced our alert level framework. Likewise, in our care facilities, they were already implementing procedures to reduce visitors, to help reduce the likelihood that their residents would become infected. And so, whilst it may not have been characterised as a bubble at that point in time, certainly our care facilities, even before the first lockdown, were starting to put in place, I guess, sort of the equivalent of bubble-type arrangements. It wasn't until we went into the lockdown that the idea of the bubble was widely adopted and communicated.
Thank you. This is a question for Dr. Tegnell, and it's from the Scottish Women's Rights Organisation, I think, double check. And it is whether and to what extent Sweden experienced an increase in instances of domestic violence during the pandemic.
No, we did not. And there are signals from several other countries with long-term lockdowns and so on that there were an increase in domestic violence. But in Sweden it remained at a very constant level, and I think even slightly diminished, I must say. But I need to check the data to be completely sure. But at least there was no increase.
Thank you. And this is one for both Surashi and Dr. Tegnell. People with PMLD rely on routine and structure as part of maintaining their mental and physical well-being. In Scotland, children with PMLD rely on access to education as part of maintaining their well-being in this respect. Children with PMLD also receive a wraparound service in special education settings, whereby they have access to additional critical support and treatment such as physiotherapy, speech and language therapy, life-enhancing postural support, purposeful and meaningful educational activities, etc. Please can you explain whether there is a similar system in place for children with PMLD in your respective jurisdictions, and whether access to education for this group or prioritising the return of education for this group was adopted by the decision makers in your countries? So if we could perhaps start with Sir Ashley.
I don't have any detail about whether there was specific consideration of children with disabilities or special needs, special education needs. So saying, I know that there was a huge amount of interaction between the staff in the Ministry of Health and staff in the Ministry of Education, and that the needs of different groups, and particularly those that might have been disadvantaged in some way, or that had special education and care needs, would have been a specific consideration in the development of both policy and also the delivery. And a lot of those children would be receiving care services and special education services. So I can't provide any detail, but I know that they would have been considered in the development of the operational policies and processes.
Thank you very much. And Dr. Tegnell, was that the situation or what was the situation in Sweden?
Yeah, I mean, for once we kept the schools and those kind of services open, so there was no sort of official. I don't have any details if to any extent they were discontinued, but at least there was no formal recommendations or regulations that they should be. Mm-hmm. Rather the opposite. I mean, we had quite clear communication around that disadvantaged group should really receive the kind of help they needed through this situation, and my impression is that that also happened.
Thank you. And I think this might be, yes, we have another question here. This is from Scottish COVID Bereaved, and it relates again to evidence given by Dr. Ashley Croft the other day, which who I mentioned earlier. It's quite long. I'll be reading. You've had sight of this already. I think the extract from the transcript, but I'll read it out and try to read it slowly. On the 23rd of September 2025, Dr. Ashley Croft was referred to extracts from Dr. Tegnall's book by counsel to the inquiry. In particular, counsel to the inquiry referred to page 209, where it is said to be stated, and this is from your book, by early spring 2021, almost all elderly people in Sweden had been vaccinated. We thought that things would now quieten down on the COVID-19 front, but the forecasts generated by my colleague showed that there was still a high risk of a new spike in cases, and so it proved. I'll read out the exchange because the question is going to be, did the witness mean what he wrote in his book, or does he wish to qualify what is said in the book in the manner that described by Dr. Croft, which I'll read out now. So on the 23rd of September, there was the following exchange with the witness. He said, I think that refers to the Israeli experience. Is that right? That was from counsel. The answer by Dr. Croft was, oh yes, possibly, but since the elderly people were being given the priority correctly in Sweden for vaccines, I would imagine he's also referring to younger groups who hadn't been vaccinated and who hadn't acquired infection naturally during the previous year because they were engaged in the principle of voluntary action, meaning personal distancing and enhanced hygiene. So by good fortune, they hadn't acquired COVID. So they were acquiring it as 2021 went on. So the principle of voluntary action in Sweden had effectively slowed the spread of the virus, and the late effects of it had not yet been seen as that year started. I think he was probably referring to those, possibly also to some, an element of waning efficacy of the vaccine in the main target groups as well. He doesn't quite clarify what he means, but that, and then the transcript goes inaudible. And then the question put to Dr. Croft was, he goes on in the same passage, the vaccinations had not stopped the spread of COVID-19, which I think is well known. You referred to in your, and then he says yes, supplemental report, yes. And then the questioner says, but he goes on, they offered highly effective protection against severe disease and death, but only weak protection against reinfection, so that's fine. But I just want to ask you specifically on the point he makes. They offered highly effective protection against severe disease and death. And the answer was yes. He doesn't qualify that in any way by reference to particular groups, such as the elderly or the vulnerable. And Dr. Croft said, no, he doesn't. No, obviously he can't be. He can't qualify every statement he's making ad infinitum, or his prose would become very turgid. But I'm sure he would, well, I anticipate he would have wanted to qualify that specifically if asked. So the question is, did the witness mean what he wrote in his book, or does he wish to qualify what is said in the book in the manner described by Croft, i.e., do you want to qualify what you said? Should I read your extract again? Or?
No. I hope I remember what I once wrote, but maybe not word by word. But let me do it like this to describe the situation we were in. And it was quite clear to us as we progressed in the spring of 2021 that the number of people that were susceptible to the disease were increasing. And just as was said in the statement, waning immunity was becoming very important because we had had a period with not so much better the disease. New variants had come in, and even if the vaccine was quite good at helping our health services to survive, it didn't really stop the spread in the community. So there was a number of factors saying that, yes, the likelihood of a new wave was becoming more and more imminent, and we saw the same development in many other countries. So that's the background to the statement that we had many indications on that in spite of what we considered a successful vaccination campaign, we did understand that we would see more spread of the virus with the new variants and so on. And that also happened. We had probably the highest spread of the virus of any time during the pandemic, during that spring, because so many different factors came together and made it possible for the virus to spread in a way that we hadn't really seen before. And that meant that the pressure on the health services was considerable also that spring, but it was mainly due to not due to a failure of the vaccines, but mainly due to that the amount of people getting infected was much, much higher than we ever had before.
And in fairness, you've said that on at least one occasion during your evidence in the course of the last day and a half.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just because I looked at this with domestic abuse and so on, and the police did not have any more reports, did not increase in Sweden, but of course many people were worried about it, so there were more reports, more the helplines and so on were more used and stuff like that, but there is no indication that the abuse went to the level of police reports and actual legal proceedings and so on. That remained stable.
Thank you. Okay. My Lord, I understand that there was one more application that wasn't processed earlier, so we're a little bit early for the 3 o'clock break, but I wonder if it might be opportune to rise now and then come back and we can deal with this when we come back.
By all means, that seems sensible. So we'll rise now and come back at 3.
All right.
Yeah, thanks. Right, when you're ready. Yes.
Thank you, my Lord. As I said before the break, there was just one more question, and this is for Sir Ashley, and it's from Scottish Trades Union Congress and Scottish Hazards. So actually the question is, what type of enforcement mechanisms, if any, were used in New Zealand to ensure adherence to measures taken in the elimination approach to the virus, in particular enforcement of the full population lockdowns with restrictions on movement and compliance with measures by businesses or employers? You answered yesterday in relation to enforcement generally. I think you said the police were responsible for that. Is that the case in respect of businesses and employers? Was their compliance enforced by other means?
So employers, the directors and the senior executives of any organisation have very strict health and safety obligations, legal obligations, and there is provision for inspection and enforcement by a government agency that's tasked with doing that. But the most important mechanism really for ensuring that they were complying was the legal requirements on them, with quite significant fines if they weren't complying with those legal obligations, which in the case of the pandemic included protecting their workers by implementing the measures that the government was requiring of them, and some of those mandated. And likewise, there were mechanisms for people to raise concerns, and unions in New Zealand would play an important role there. If members felt that there was a lack of compliance, then it was common for unions to raise those either directly with employers or, if necessary, with the relevant government agency.
Let me be rather lawyerly. The employers, directors, obviously have an obligation under whatever the relatively regulatory or statutory framework is. But, and I think this is simply an application of common sense, simply because there's a regulation or a statutory requirement does not necessarily mean it will always be complied with. And not surprisingly, in a country like New Zealand, there are regulatory bodies, the equivalent to Health and Safety at Work Executive in Britain, who can, if information, they can do routine inspections, but if information gets to them that there's a departure from the regulations, they can take steps to enforce it. But in the context, and this is in the light of your evidence, in the context of the COVID pandemic and the regulations that you gave us very clear evidence about yesterday, I'm assuming that if a breach, and you've already given an indication of how a breach might be brought to the attention of the police, if a breach was reported by a trade union or a whistleblower or anything like that, then if I understood your evidence yesterday correctly, then the police are the ones that would at that stage step in and take the initial actions to sort things out.
My recollection is that, and I think you've described the situation well, my recollection is that for the most part it would be the relevant agency, and that could be a local branch. Let's say it was a business, and it may even be that it's an employers' federation, or someone from a peak body that might, in the first instance, go and have a conversation. An educative approach would be the first response. Really a sort of a strong enforcement, whether it's from a relevant agency, in this case would be the inspectorate of our health and safety agency, or the police, would be probably a second or third tier response.
No, that's clear.
And I think the advantage, we talked this morning about the communication strategy. The advantage was there was a very, very clear understanding by the whole population of what the expectations were, and so there was a strong social imperative really for businesses and employers of all nature to comply with the obligations and the expectations.
That was my understanding, which is why I asked you the clarifying, or made the clarifying remarks. So that's very clear. Thank you.
My Lord, there are no further questions. So.
Good. Excellent, well done. Right, all that remains to be seen is to again, and this time having heard what you've said as well, thank you both very fully and sincerely, not only for coming to give us the benefit of your advice, but obviously, patently obviously, doing a great deal of work in preparation for this. I speak on behalf of the inquiry, and I think if I can be so bold, speak on behalf of the population of Scotland, if I have authority to do so, to thank you for your willingness to participate and in being of such assistance to us. We're very grateful. Thank you. We will now adjourn until Monday morning at 9:45, when we will have a 2-day or a day and a half plus questions of discussion, hearing from expert witnesses about scientific considerations relating to lockdown and other restrictions. So, Monday morning, 9:45. Thank you again. Thank you.